Owen now. Thanks, that's great.
Well, friends, firstly, it's great to be here. It always throws people a bit when I start speaking because people wonder who the 13-year-old at the front is. Sometimes people think I've wandered off the set of Home Alone 1. But when I go and telly, people ask, why is he doing his paper round? But I've taken the evening off my paper round to talk to you today. I'm really glad to be in Portsmouth for one big particular reason, and that's because my granddad actually grew up here in this city. He was an apprentice dock worker on the docks from the late 30s onwards, including at the outset of World War II. And for him, this is where his politics came from. This is what, in a sense, brought him into the Labour movement. It's what brought him into the ideas of the left. And now in his old age, very old age, he speaks with increasing nostalgia about this city in which he grew up. I'm really glad to be here, above all, because of this fantastic new initiative which Unite have set up, applying the principles of the trade union movement to community organising, that an injury to one is an injury to all, that unity is strength. And at a time like this, when working people, disabled people and the unemployed are being made to pay for a crisis they had absolutely nothing to do with, those principles of our movement have never been more relevant. Now, in terms of this so-called debate on welfare, this toxic debate on welfare, we can't divorce it, of course, from the austerity offensive which is being unleashed on this country by a government which did not even win the last election. And we should say this, that everything we warned about as a movement has come to pass. Not that we can take any joy from that, given the terrible consequences austerity is having on our communities right across the country. Whether it be, if you think about the deficit, they accused us of being deficit deniers. Well, the underlying deficit is now growing precisely because of their self-defeating policies. It's 11% bigger than it was a year ago. The debt is piling up. It's estimated that they'll borrow about £200 billion more than they projected over the course of this Parliament. Growth, well, where do you even start? I don't know if people remember that Labour mocked up a poster of David Cameron as Gene Hunt from Life on Mars, smugly perching in an Audi Quattro, and it said on it, don't let him bring us back to the 1980s. But how wrong they were, because this is a far worse crisis than the 1980s. It's worse than the last double-dip recession of the 1970s. It's longer than the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is now the longest economic crisis that this country has gone through in modern history. And of course, we even had the credit rating stripped the other week. And I should say this, opponents of austerity never listened to the goons of the credit rating agencies who gave Lehman Brothers a clean bill of health on the brink of its implosion. But at the same time, this government staked everything on keeping the confidence of these credit rating agencies. In 2009, when this country was put on negative watch, George Osborne actually called for a snap election. In 2010, they stood on a manifesto which said deficit reduction was all about keeping the confidence of the credit rating agencies. He said having that AAA rating showed the confidence of the rest of the world in his policies. And yet, of course, when it was stripped, he somehow took that as vindication, that showed the need to cut even more. But the fact is, and this is the point we have to make, even on its own rationale, even on its own claims, austerity has failed on every single measure. But the other point, and this is a really important point to make, is that's not really what austerity is all about. It's got two real aims. Firstly, to make working people, disabled people, unemployed people and others pay for a genuine crisis, but a crisis they had absolutely nothing to do with. Now, since the beginning of this crisis, we've been told we're all in this together. It's a statement that's veered from the offensive to the ludicrous ever since it was first said. Because whilst it's a very serious economic crisis for the majority, and we can't emphasise that enough, we're going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since my granddad was born here in this city in the 1920s. It's projected that by 2020, the average Briton will be no better off than they were at the turn of this century. That low earners will be 15% poorer by 2020. And just to put that into sort of more concrete terms, less abstract terms, Save the Children did a study a few months ago. They spoke to thousands of parents and children right across the country. They found the world which most politicians and journalists have absolutely no interest in. And that is where parents are having to make choices that millionaires in this cabinet can never have to dream of making, between heating their homes and feeding their kids, having to skip their own meals in order to make sure that their sons and daughters are properly fed. At the same time, it's reported that school lunch portions are being cut because of budget cuts. Breakfast clubs are being cut. This is the 7th richest country on earth, and apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest children. So whilst there's a serious economic crisis for the majority, it remains boom time for the people at the top. Each year the Sunday Times Rich List look at the top 1,000 richest people in this country. In 2010 their wealth went up by 30%. It's the biggest jump ever recorded in the history of that list. The next year it went up by a fifth. Last year it jumped again. Crisis for the majority, boom time for those at the top, many of whom caused the crisis that we're currently in. So that's one aim of austerity, but the other, and we've got to be very clear about this, is it has become an opportunity to introduce policies that this lot always wanted to introduce, but never thought they could otherwise get away with. I'll give you a few examples. The privatisation of our National Health Service, which they didn't even have the guts to put to the election, and for good reason. Because as the Tory Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, said in the 80s, the NHS is the closest the English have to a religion. They knew its popularity, which is why they didn't do that. Whether it be the assault on education, the trebling of tuition fees, the scrapping of EMA, the assault on comprehensive education, whether it be removing whatever remaining rights working people have in this country, hiring Adrian Beecroft, a billionaire asset stripper and multi-million Tory donor, to draw up a charter stripping what remaining rights workers have. He actually had the audacity to call Vince Cable a socialist, which is the worst smear against the good name of socialism I've ever heard. But the other point, and this is what we're talking about, is the assault on the welfare state. Again, this is something they always wanted to do. They opposed the very building of the welfare state in the 1940s. Because they have indicated that itself has a very clear political aim. Because what they're trying to do is redirect people's entirely justifiable anger at the fact they're getting poorer year on year, from the people who caused this crisis to people's neighbours down the streets. If you're in a low-paid job, because your boss has been cutting your wages, because the Tories have been cutting your tax credits, who are you supposed to hate? The unemployed scrounger next door. If you're in the private sector and you don't have a pension because pension coverage in the private sector has been trashed by bosses in the last 15 years, who are you supposed to hate? The nurse next door who still has an intact pension. If you're struggling to make ends meet, it's everyone, the supposedly disabled person who's faking it, the immigrant down the road who's got access to luxurious benefits they don't even have access to. It's the politics of divide and rule. And each time their argument is the same. You've been mugged, and therefore your less deserving neighbour should be mugged as well. And as a movement, if there's anything this can do, Unite Community initiative, is to help unite people who really are in it together. And that is why I'm so glad to be here today. Now the point about, as I say, the assault on the welfare state, is what they've done with their allies in the media is to hunt down the most extreme, grotesque, shameless examples and pass it off as though it's the tip of the iceberg. The idea of someone dribbling on their sofa all day with 50 kids running around in mansions made out of widescreen television sets. And the fact is, what they've done is they've done that to airbrush out of existence the reality. I mean, they hunt down these large families. Just to give you an example of how absurd it is, there are 1.35 million households in this country with kids, in which at least one adult is claiming out-of-work benefits. Do you know how many of those are a family of above 10? It's not 500,000, it's not 200,000, it's not even 1,000, it's 190. And yet I think by now each and every single one's had their own reality TV show. Then what they're doing is to airbrush out of that reality. I'll just give you a few examples. The other week, it was reported, not very prominently I should add, but Costa Coffee in Nottingham, they opened up a new branch with 8 near minimum wage jobs, not even full-time positions. Do you know how many people applied for those 8 near minimum wage jobs? 1,701 people. That is the desperation that exists out there for work which doesn't even exist. Give you another example, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they did a study looking at young people, and they found that for every single job in retail, so supermarkets, shops and so on, for every single vacancy there were 66 young people looking for work. Now many of those young people they found weren't even hearing back when they sent their CVs in. Now the reality of young unemployment, as many people in this room will know, are devastating, and studies have shown this. That if you're out of work and you're young, you're more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression, but also you're more likely to be unemployed in later life, to have lower wages. It's a so-called scarring impact. That is the brutal consequences of youth unemployment. It's not just when you're young, it can be for the rest of your life. Now, the whole point, as I say, of this campaign of demonisation is to deflect anger and also to justify the assault. And next month, April, is going to be a brutal month. It's going to be the cruelest month, if you like. Black April, whatever you want to call it. Because a whole range of cuts are going to come in at the same time. Now, one cut, and if there's anything I have to say that you remember about this government, is this. It's the so-called Welfare Operating Bill, which was introduced in January, cutting both in-work and out-work benefits in real terms. And the reason I'm asking you to remember that is because if you look back at that debate, what we saw was the spectacle of a load of overpaid Tory MPs laughing, jeering and baying as they went through the voting lobbies to vote to reduce the incomes of the poor as a deliberate act of government policy for the first time since 1931. Now, we know 60% of those affected are people in work, but that's not to say the people out of work are somehow the skivers, as this government has tried to tell us. These are people themselves desperate for work. But this was, again, it was an attempt to tap into this idea, as Leanne said, of strivers versus skivers. The idea of the work-shy and the feckless hiding behind their curtains. It's a daily diet of poison we get in this country. But that is going to have devastating consequences for people across this country, as I've said, who are already struggling to make ends meet. And again, it's going to be a double whammy for many of them, because you're going to have your tax credits cut, and at the same time, your pay's been cut in real terms for years. First you're mugged by your boss, and then you're mugged by this government. Another, again, striking policy, which we haven't talked about, the bedroom tax. That is going to hit up to 670,000 households right across this country. Now, the households that are going to be affected, again, some of the poorest in society, are going to face up to £80 extra every single month. 2/3 of those households have people who are disabled within them. Now, they say to these people, go and downsize. But there's nowhere for them to downsize to, because successive governments failed to build council housing in this country, which is why we have overcrowding. But again, it's the same policy, divide and rule. Instead of being angry at the government for not building enough housing, you're supposed to be angry at your probably disabled neighbour who has a so-called spare room. Or, for example, a family which is split up and they've got a room for their kid to come and stay, and so on and so forth. But we did actually win exemptions of the bedroom tax, and that's an important point to make, whether it be for the sons and daughters sent off to Afghanistan and foster parents in some circumstances. And that is important to remember, because it shows that we can win when we put them under pressure and scrutinise them in the way we have over the bedroom tax. But as I say, it's not just the bedroom tax. Many of those people will also be hit by cuts to council tax benefit, forcing low-paid workers and unemployed people to pay council tax for the very first time. We've got disabled people having their benefits cut, and many of them being forced through the most humiliating and degrading experience at the hands of ATOS, with sick and disabled people being found fit for work and then having their benefits stripped from them. But when we talk about all this, it's easy to kind of end up wallowing in despair. There's one thing I've noticed. I've done, God, hundreds of talks right across the country now. There is no shortage of anger and frustration out there, but there's not a lot of hope. And without hope, you don't get anger, you get despair, you get people being resigned, you get people throwing things at the television, but not feeling they can go out there and fight back, or you get their anger being directed, as I say, at their neighbours. So we have to have a coherent alternative that gives people hope. And I just want to talk quickly what those alternatives can be. Because they say welfare spending's too high, and do you know what? They've got a point. It's not to do with a bunch of dribbling scroungers on their sofas, though. It's a triple crisis. It's the housing crisis, it's the low wages crisis, and it's the jobs crisis. Now, taxpayers have every right to be furious about the £23 billion being wasted every single year on housing benefit. That's not going in the pockets of the tenants. It's lining the pockets of landlords charging extortionate rents because successive governments didn't build council housing because we didn't control our rents. If we build council housing in this country, we'll start lifting the borrowing cap imposed on councils, then we'd be able to create jobs, stimulate the economy. That's what we did after 1945, after all. Also, bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list, but we'd also bring down the £23 billion housing benefit, or what we should call landlord subsidy bill. The other point we need to make. Tax credits. Now, tax credits are a lifeline for millions of people. But let's be honest about what they are. They're a subsidy for low pay because bosses aren't paying their workers properly. If we actually had a living wage in this country and jobs that actually paid properly, then instead of wasting billions on tax credits, as well as other benefits, housing benefit, 93% of new claimants are people in working households, we'd actually be able to bring down the billions being spent there. It'd also be good for the economy because we know that when you're poorer and you get extra money in your pockets, you're more likely to spend it, whilst if you're rich and you get a nice tax cut, you're more likely to shove it in the Cayman Islands in an offshore account. And the other point, the jobs crisis. As Keaton said in the 1930s, you look after the unemployment lines, the deficit will sort itself out. Now that is a triple crisis. Jobs, low wages and housing, and we can argue with them by saying we'll bring down welfare spending, but we'll do it by stop subsidising rip-off landlords and bosses instead of kicking the poorest people in society. Other things we need to talk about. The banks. Now, we nationalised the debts and privatised the profits. We don't have any control over what those banks do. We might have bailed them out, we've kept them at arm's length, they're still paying out bonuses and they're still not lending. So you should be calling for a public investment bank that we, the taxpayers, own in order to rebuild our economy. Link it to an industrial strategy, as they've had in Germany, where instead of having this hands-off approach, you let the market decide, the state doesn't pick winners or losers. That's what New Labour and the Tories said for so many years. You actually intervene, and in Germany they've created hundreds of thousands of jobs in the renewable energy sector, taking on the environmental crisis and taking on the jobs crisis too, creating skilled, well-regarded, respected, secure jobs, and that is exactly what we need in this country. And of course, tax justice. We hear about benefit fraud every single day, and it does exist. According to the government's own figures, it's less than 1% of welfare spending, about £1.2 billion a year. Compare that to tax avoidance by the people at the top. £25 billion at least every single year. The likes of Sir Philip Green, who owns Top Man and Top Chop and other companies. Now, he's registered his company under his wife's name in Monaco, so he doesn't have to pay any taxes. He wasn't attacked by this government like Jimmy Carr. He was appointed as an advisor by this government on how to cut our public services. So we need an all-out war against people at the top not paying their taxes, and we need to be arguing to make them actually pay higher taxes, because that 50p tax, which this government has got rid of, was one of the most popular policies of the last Labour government. Even a majority of Conservative voters opposed getting rid of that tax. There's your centre ground policy, if you like. So we need to be arguing for these policies. They're perfectly mainstream, common sense policies, which instead of making people pay for a crisis they had nothing to do with, actually help rebuild our communities and our society without attacking the people at the bottom. But the other thing we have to do, and this is where this comes in so importantly, is to give a voice to people. Because what people connect with above all else aren't these facts and statistics I can just machine gun around. People connect with stories. That's why they hunt down the most extreme examples, scroungers down the road, because they know that that's what connects with people. So we have to give a platform to people who are being hammered at the moment, unemployed people, disabled people, others who are just desperate in modern Britain, and yet are smeared and demonised on a daily basis. We have to give them a platform, and that is why I know Unite are also setting up a welfare campaign with PCS, a national campaign which will help give a platform to those people in order to challenge that demonisation, if you like. Now the reason this is so important, as again Leanne said, is at a time when you've got so many people who are in insecure work, and it's not just people who are unemployed. We know the official unemployment figures, but if you take into account people forced to do part-time work because they can't get full-time work, people who are so-called self-unemployed, they register self-employed but they can't get any meaningful work. My dad was in that position in the 1990s, and others not included in the official statistics. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there are 6.5 million people in this country looking for full-time work who can't get it. Those are the people the trade union movement need to be trying to reach out to. Because when you don't have communities built around factories and mines and docks in the way you used to, when you have people increasingly in a hire and fire service sector, we need to organise in the community as well as the workplace. Now, one of the other things that I'm working with, which Unite is central to, is called the People's Assembly. What the People's Assembly is trying to do is link together groups right across the country, anyone who wants to take on austerity, whether they're in a party or none, and we're meeting in Westminster Central Hall on June the 22nd. But at the same time, we're going to be launching and having rallies right across the country, and I hope Unite Community will be very much involved in that as well, trying to get people involved from local communities to help build a broad-based anti-austerity movement. And the point, really important point, is we've got to start talking about our victories, because often as a movement we wallow in our defeats. And I just want to end by talking about things that give me hope. Last year I went to Leeds and I met bin collectors who went on strike in 2009 when their Tory Lib Dem coalition council, before that was all the rage, tried to impose a cut on them in their pay of up to 1/3. And they went on strike for 11 weeks in winter, in freezing cold temperatures, and they got up every single day at 5 AM. And they won. I'll give you another example. Electricians in London who went on strike against Balfour Beatty, a multinational company. And they went on strike and they took part in occupations and they won. Another example, going back years, the anti-poll tax march and that movement. I actually remember that because my parents took me on the march when I was 5 years old. It surprised me that I actually was alive at the time. But I went on it in Glasgow. Actually started a chant, didn't know what I was chanting. You think I'm precocious now, seriously. But back in that huge march, I remember in Glasgow, and obviously the one in London, which I wasn't at, but you had a huge civil disobedience campaign, and Thatcher seemed invincible at the time. She picked off everybody, including the miners, and yet the poll tax was defeated and she was booted from power. And that's the point we've always got to remember, which is our own power and our own strength. That when people collectively organise, that when people unite with people, when we have determination and courage, and we have a coherent alternative that gives us hope, then we can fight and we can win. And at a time when people are being made to pay for this crisis, I'm absolutely convinced that we can turn this around. We stand together, we fight together, and we will win this together.